7,000 corpses in 17 minutes. That is not a typo. That is not an exaggeration. That is the cold mathematical reality of what happened on September 7th, 1191, when Richard the Lionheart turned the coastal plains of Arsuf into a graveyard that would haunt Saladin's nightmares for the rest of his life. Before we talk about how this massacre became possible, you need to understand something that will make your blood run cold. 20,000 Crusaders stretched across 12 miles of burning sand, their columns so thin that a single coordinated attack could slice it into helpless fragments like a butcher cutting meat. Every step south from Acre dragged them deeper into what every man knew was a trap designed by the greatest military mind in the Islamic world. The air shimmered at 110 degrees Fahrenheit by sunrise, turning steel armor into personal ovens that literally cooked knights alive inside their mail. Horses collapsed every quarter mile, their riders forced to continue on foot through sand that burned through boot leather, or die where they fell under the merciless Palestinian sun. Picture yourself as a Crusader knight watching the horizon dance with heat, mirages that made distance impossible to judge, knowing with absolute certainty that somewhere beyond your vision 30,000 Muslim warriors were positioning themselves for the killing blow that would end Christian presence in the Holy Land forever. Richard the Lionheart's gamble defied every single principle of medieval warfare that had been written in blood over centuries. Marching 20,000 men along a narrow coastal strip, with hostile territory crawling with enemy scouts on one side, and the Mediterranean Sea offering no escape on the other, violated the most basic rule of military survival that even peasant conscripts understood. Never trap yourself against an obstacle with no room to maneuver. Yet here he was, the King of England, leading the largest Crusader army assembled since the catastrophic disaster at Hattin 4 years earlier, stretched impossibly thin along the ancient road to Jaffa, like a serpent with its belly exposed. The mathematics were absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood military logistics. His column extended 12 full miles from vanguard to rearguard, a distance so vast that a messenger on a fresh horse needed 2 full hours to travel from front to back, meaning half his army could be slaughtered before the other half even knew battle had begun. At any given moment during that nightmare march, half his army could not see the other half through the dust and heat haze. If Saladin struck the center with his full force of 30,000 warriors, the Crusaders would be fighting 3 completely separate battles with absolutely no hope of mutual support or coordinated defense. But here is what the chronicles written by monks in their safe monasteries do not tell you about Richard's impossible situation that morning. The English king had no choice whatsoever in this suicidal march. Behind them lay nothing but the smoking ruins of coastal fortifications that Saladin had systematically destroyed with methodical precision, leaving no sanctuary for retreat. Ahead, through the shimmering heat, waited Jaffa, the only port between Acre and Egypt capable of supplying a major army with food and weapons. Without capturing Jaffa intact within days, the Third Crusade would starve to death within months, and every knight riding south knew it. The English king had calculated with his usual precision that his 20,000 troops could reach the port in 5 days of brutal forced marching if they pushed beyond human endurance. What he had not calculated, what he could not have predicted, was that Saladin would be waiting with the largest Muslim army assembled since the reconquest of Jerusalem, 30,000 warriors who had spent 4 years crushing every Christian force they encountered. The enemy force, shadowing their march through the hills, was beyond human comprehension in scale and organization. 30,000 warriors moved like a dark tide through the hills, paralleling the coast road, coordinating their movements with signal fires. Saladin's host included 12,000 Turkish horse archers whose composite bows could pierce chain mail at 200 yards, 8,000 Kurdish and Arab heavy cavalry carrying 12-foot lances that could punch through shield and body with a single thrust, and 10,000 infantry, support troops that completed an army which had crushed every Christian force it encountered for 4 consecutive years without a single defeat. The psychological warfare had already begun days before the armies met, wearing down Christian morale with scientific precision. Every single morning the Crusaders woke to the distant thunder of Muslim war drums, echoing from the hills like the heartbeat of some monstrous entity. Every evening they watched signal fires bloom across the horizon like fallen stars, Saladin's commanders coordinating the movements of forces the Christians could not see or count, creating the terrifying impression of infinite enemies surrounding them. But what killed more Crusaders than Muslim arrows during that march was the heat itself, which was an enemy more deadly than in force. Men collapsed inside their armor like meat left too long in an oven, dragged unconscious from the column by comrades who could barely walk themselves. Water sources along the route had been systematically poisoned or destroyed by retreating Muslim forces executing Saladin's scorched earth strategy with ruthless efficiency. The precious few wells they encountered produced brackish liquid that left men retching and weak, sometimes killing them faster than simply dying of thirst. Richard himself rode at the column center, where his royal banner made him a target visible for miles, in every direction, constantly calculating distances and casualties and time like a merchant counting coins, knowing that one miscalculation meant total annihilation. His scouts reported the same terrifying intelligence hour after hour as they galloped back with sweat-soaked horses. Muslim forces closing from 3 directions simultaneously. The trap tightening with every step south, like a noose around a condemned man's neck. On the morning of September 6, everything changed in ways that made veteran knights cross themselves and pray. Crusader outriders came thundering back with news that drained the color from Richard's face, despite his legendary courage. Saladin's entire army had moved during the night to block the coastal road ahead with overwhelming force. 30,000 warriors had positioned themselves between the Christian army and Jaffa, cutting off the only route to salvation like a wall of steel and flesh. The trap was complete and perfect and inescapable. Richard faced an impossible choice that would have broken most commanders. Attack a force that outnumbered him 3-2 across open ground, where Muslim cavalry superiority would be absolutely decisive, or attempt a fighting withdrawal back to Acre through territory now swarming with enemy scouts, who would harass them every step until exhaustion made them easy prey. Either option meant probable annihilation of the largest Crusader army in the Holy Land. What happened next should not have been possible according to every military manual written over the past 1,000 years, yet somehow Richard made it work through genius or madness, or divine intervention, depending on who tells the story. The king, despite barely remaining conscious from heat exhaustion and dysentery that left him unable to keep down food or water, had distributed his forces throughout the 12-mile column in a formation so revolutionary it would change medieval warfare forever and be studied in military academies 7 centuries later. As dawn broke on September 7th, with the sun rising like a ball of fire, Saladin's crescent formation emerged from the morning mist like a vision of the apocalypse that Christian priests had warned about in sermon. 30,000 warriors arranged themselves across the coastal plain in a perfect killing arc that stretched from horizon to horizon, their polished weapons catching the first rays of sunlight and flashing like a river of light. The sight that greeted Richard's exhausted scouts defied comprehension and made grown men weep in despair. From the hills above Arsuf to the very edge of the Mediterranean Sea, where waves crashed against rocks, an unbroken line of cavalry and archers and infantry stretched for over 2 miles without a single gap. Saladin had committed his entire force, every single warrior under his command, to this single decisive engagement that would determine the fate of the Third Crusade and perhaps Christianity itself in the East. The Sultan's tactical genius was immediately apparent to anyone with military training. His right wing, commanded by his nephew Taqi ad-Din, who had never lost a battle, positioned 10,000 Kurdish cavalry on elevated ground that dominated the coastal road like a fortress, giving them the high ground advantage that every commander dreams of. These were veteran horsemen who had shattered Christian armies from Damascus to Cairo over 4 years of continuous warfare, their lances gleaming like a steel forest in the rising sun that promised death to anyone who approached. Saladin himself commanded the center with 8,000 Mamluk guards, positioned like the tip of a spear aimed at Richard's heart. These were the elite slave soldiers whose discipline and ferocity had become legendary across the entire Islamic world, warriors whose training began in childhood and continued until they became perfect killing machines. Each Mamluk represented years of training and a fortune in equipment, warriors who knew no retreat and accepted no quarter and would die before abandoning their position. But it was the left wing that would prove most deadly in the coming hours. 7,000 Turkish horse archers spread across the plain like a dark tide, preparing to drown the Christians, their composite bows capable of loosing 15,000 arrows per minute at maximum rate when all archers fired together. Behind them moved 5,000 infantry carrying the black banners of jihad volunteers who had traveled from across the Muslim world for the chance to drive Christianity from the Holy Land forever and earn paradise through martyrdom. The mathematical reality was inescapable to anyone who could count. Even if every Christian fought with superhuman skill and courage, the numbers guaranteed Muslim victory through simple attrition. Here is what the Muslim chroniclers, writing in Cairo and Damascus, do not tell you about that morning before battle began. Saladin had spent the previous night in prayer, not from religious devotion, as the historians claim, but from genuine uncertainty about the outcome that kept him awake. 4 years of constant warfare against the Crusaders had taught him to respect their desperate courage, born of knowing they had nowhere to retreat. Richard's reputation preceded him like a storm front, and the Sultan knew from bitter experience that cornered Crusaders fought with the fury of men who expected paradise or death with equal anticipation. By the 3rd hour after sunrise, when the heat was already becoming unbearable, the psychological assault began with scientific precision, designed to break Christian morale before a single arrow flew. Muslim drummers positioned throughout the crescent formation started a rhythmic pounding that could be heard 5 miles away across the coastal plain, a sound like distant thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound rolled across the plain like waves crashing on a beach, punctuated by the high wailing of horns and the battle cries of 30,000 voices raised in unison, calling for Christian blood. The effect on Christian morale was immediate and devastating. in ways that cannot be fully described. Horses reared and fought their bridles, as if they could sense the doom approaching. Men crossed themselves repeatedly with shaking hands, and whispered prayers became audible throughout the column as knights prepared to meet their maker. Then came the arrows that would turn the morning into a nightmare. 15,000 Turkish horsemen began circling the Crusader formation at extreme range, like wolves circling wounded prey, each man loosing arrows as quickly as he could draw and release without aiming carefully, because accuracy mattered less than volume. The mathematics of this sustained barrage were absolutely terrifying to anyone caught beneath it. At full intensity, the Muslim archers could maintain a rate of 30,000 arrows per minute, a steel rain that literally turned the morning sky dark as if night had fallen at noon. Crusader shields sprouted arrow shafts like porcupine quills within minutes, the wood splintering under repeated impacts. Horses screamed and fell, thrashing their riders, crushed beneath armored bodies, weighing hundreds of pounds, or left on foot in the growing chaos as formations began to break apart. What happened next pushed the Christian army to its absolute breaking point, where discipline turns to panic. Saladin ordered his cavalry to begin probing attacks, testing the Crusader formation for weaknesses like a blacksmith testing metal. 500 Kurdish horsemen would charge directly at a section of the line, at full gallop, then wheel away at the last possible moment before contact, then attack from a completely different angle, repeating this torture for hours. The psychological pressure was unbearable for men trained to charge and fight, not stand still and die. Knights gripped their reins until their knuckles went white, watching enemies approach close enough to see their faces, and then retreat without being able to strike back, violating every instinct that made them warriors. The most vulnerable point in the entire Christian line was the rear guard, where the Knights Hospitaller fought a desperate holding action against increasingly aggressive Muslim assaults that threatened to collapse the entire formation. Brother Garnier de Nablus, the Hospitaller marshal, who had survived 20 years of warfare, watched his mounted brothers fall one by one to the endless arrow storm that never stopped. By midday, when the sun reached its merciless peak, half his knights had lost their war horses to arrows and fought on foot, their heavy armor becoming a death sentence in the scorching heat that turned metal into branding iron. Richard himself was beginning to crack under the impossible pressure of command that would have killed most men. Witnesses reported seeing the king swaying in his saddle from heat exhaustion and dysentery, combining with the stress of command to push him toward collapse. Yet, every time his subordinates begged permission to charge to break the suffocating defensive posture that was killing them slowly and strike back at their tormentors, Richard's answer remained the same without variation. Hold formation. Wait for the perfect moment. Let them come to us. But discipline has limits, even among the most dedicated warriors, and the Hospitallers had reached theirs after 3 hours of being used as target practice. At 11 o'clock on that blazing September morning, the breaking point arrived with mathematical precision. Brother Garnier de Nablus, Marshal of the Knights Hospitaller, watched the last of his mounted brothers fall to Turkish arrows with a shaft through the throat. 43 knights reduced to 17 in less than 3 hours of sustained bombardment. The rear guard was disintegrating under pressure that no medieval formation had ever been designed to withstand for this long. His voice cracked as he sent yet another messenger galloping toward Richard's position. Through the arrow storm, the man's mission probably suicidal. We cannot hold much longer. Grant us permission to charge, or we die where we stand." Richard's response came back within minutes, carried by a blood-soaked sergeant whose horse had 3 arrow shafts protruding from its neck and was barely able to walk. "Hold formation. Let them come to us." The king's tactical discipline remained absolute, even as his army bled to death around him, and men screamed in frustration and pain. But discipline has limits. When men are dying slowly, and the Hospitallers had reached theirs in ways that would change history. What happened next would determine whether Christianity survived in the Holy Land or perished in the sand outside Arsuf. The moment that changed everything, the moment that broke the deadlock and unleashed 17 minutes of perfect carnage, began with a single night's moment of uncontrollable rage that could no longer be contained. Brother Baldwin of Caron, watching his comrades die under the endless arrow storm, while forbidden to strike back like a chained dog, watching its master beaten finally snapped with a scream of pure fury. Sources differ on his exact words in that moment, but the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi, written by an eyewitness, records him shouting something that roughly translates to "God wills it, that we die like warriors, not cattle, waiting for slaughter." He spurred his warhorse forward with a savage kick, alone directly into the massed ranks of Taqi ad-Din's Kurdish cavalry that numbered 10,000 warriors. The psychological effect was instantaneous and catastrophic in ways no one could have predicted. Seeing one of their brothers charging to certain death, like a man possessed, triggered an emotional avalanche among the Hospitallers that could not be stopped. Marshal Garnier's desperate shouts for order disappeared beneath the thunder of hooves as 300 knights broke formation simultaneously without orders. Not a planned charge, not a tactical decision made by commanders, but pure battlefield fury made manifest in steel and horseflesh and rage that had been building for 3 hours. Here is where legend meets reality in ways that military historians still debate centuries later. Every military manual written for the next 2 centuries would describe what followed as mathematically impossible. 300 heavy cavalry, acting without coordination or support, smashing headlong into 10,000 disciplined Muslim warriors arranged in defensive formation, should have resulted in immediate annihilation within seconds. The mathematics were absolutely ludicrous to anyone who understands warfare. Each knight faced 33 enemies, odds that make survival impossible. Yet within 30 seconds of impact that could be heard across the entire battlefield, Taqi ad-Din's right wing began to collapse like a wall of sand hit by ocean waves. The secret lay in timing and terrain that Richard had been calculating all morning while appearing to barely remain conscious. Saladin's crescent formation, perfectly positioned for archery harassment from distance, proved catastrophically vulnerable to sudden close assault that gave defenders no time to reposition. The Kurdish cavalry spread thin across nearly a mile of front. To maximize their coverage, could not concentrate enough spears to stop the Christian wedge formation that hit them like a battering ram. Turkish horse archers positioned behind the cavalry line, deadly at range, with their composite bows, found their weapons completely useless in melee combat against opponents in full mail armor who could not be stopped by arrows. Most critically, for the outcome, the Muslim formation had no depth behind the front line. Break through the front rank, and there was nothing behind it except supply wagons and camp followers who scattered in panic. Richard faced the most crucial decision of the Third Crusade in that instant. Support the unauthorized charge and risk losing his entire army in a general melee where numbers favor the enemy, or let the Hospitallers die alone and maintain his careful defensive posture that was slowly bleeding him dry. What he chose in the next 30 seconds would echo through centuries of military history and determine the fate of kingdoms. The king who had spent 4 years planning this campaign, who had sacrificed thousands of lives to reach this perfect tactical position, who knew that one wrong decision meant the end of Christian presence in the Holy Land forever, had perhaps 30 seconds to choose between calculated survival, glorious suicide, the sound of Muslim horns screaming retreat signals across Saladin's right wing, made the decision for him in a way no calculation could. Taqi ad-Din's 10,000 cavalry were not just retreating in good order to regroup. They were fleeing in complete disorder like men who had seen demons from hell. The sight of Kurdish veterans who had conquered Damascus and Cairo, running in panic from a handful of Christian knights, created a psychological shockwave that rippled across the entire Muslim army like an earthquake. But Richard's real genius in that moment lay in what he did next, and this is why military academies still study this battle. Instead of committing his entire force to pursue the broken enemy wing in an uncontrolled charge, he gave 3 sharp blasts on his war horn that could be heard above the chaos. Every Crusader knight knew that signal because they had drilled with it for months during the march from Acre until it became instinct. 3 blasts meant one thing and one thing only: controlled charge through designated gaps in formation. What followed would be remembered as 17 minutes of medieval warfare, so perfect it seemed divinely inspired by God himself. The first wedge formation struck Saladin's center like a thunderbolt from heaven that nothing could stop. 3,000 knights in perfect order, maintaining formation, discipline, their lances forming an iron wall, 20 horses wide, smashed into the Mamluk elite at full gallop, with the weight of destiny behind them. The impact could be heard 3 miles away, according to witnesses, a sound like mountains colliding in an earthquake. Horses screamed as if in mortal agony. Steel shrieked against steel in a sound that haunted survivors' dreams, and 8,000 of Islam's finest warriors discovered that 4 years of unbroken victory meant absolutely nothing against this new kind of warfare that had never been seen before. Within 60 seconds of the initial impact, Saladin's impenetrable center that had held against every previous assault had been punched through like parchment, leaving a gaping hole. Richard himself led the central wedge, with his royal banner streaming behind him like a comet, his sword rising and falling as he carved a bloody path through the Mamluk ranks that parted before him. The Lionheart's blade rose and fell with mechanical precision, like a farmer harvesting wheat, each stroke calculated to kill or maim without wasted motion. His household knights followed in tight arrow formation behind him, their lances finding gaps in Muslim armor with devastating accuracy, born of years of training. Behind them rode the flower of French nobility, 300 knights who had sworn sacred oaths to reclaim Jerusalem or die in the attempt. Their war cries echoed across the battlefield above the sounds of dying men. Deus vult. God wills it. But the real devastation came from tactical innovation that Saladin had never encountered in 4 years of fighting Crusaders. The Templar wedge, 200 knights strong, and disciplined beyond human understanding, struck the Muslim left wing at precisely the moment when Turkish horse archers were repositioning to avoid the central charge. Caught between formations, with nowhere to maneuver, unable to use their bows effectively at close range, the Turks found themselves fighting a close-quarters battle they were never trained for in their entire lives. European swords designed specifically to crush through mail and bone made short work of the lighter armor favored by horse archers who relied on speed and distance. The mathematics of destruction were staggering to anyone watching from the sidelines. In the first 5 minutes of sustained contact, 1,500 Muslim warriors lay dead or dying on the sand, turning it red. The casualty exchange rate was catastrophic for Saladin's forces in ways that would change the balance of power. Each fallen knight was immediately replaced by the man behind him, maintaining the wedge's momentum forward, while each fallen Muslim created a gap that allowed Christian lances to penetrate deeper into the formation like a blade entering flesh. Saladin watched from his command hill as decades of careful recruitment and training disappeared in a storm of steel and horseflesh that he was powerless to stop. Here is what Islamic chroniclers tried desperately to hide about those 17 minutes when writing their histories. The psychological collapse was instant and total and irreversible. Warriors who had conquered Jerusalem, who had broken Christian armies from Egypt to Syria, began fleeing without orders like cattle before a fire. Saladin's personal Mamluks, men who had sworn sacred oaths to die rather than retreat under any circumstances, abandoned their posts and rode for the hills in complete panic. The Sultan found himself virtually alone on his command hill, his command structure evaporating as panic spread like wildfire through the ranks faster than any messenger could ride. The pursuit became a massacre that would be remembered for centuries. Richard's disciplined charge transformed into a hunting expedition as broken Muslim cavalry streamed across the plain in complete disorder with Crusaders in pursuit. Knights who had endured 3 hours of arrow bombardment without being able to strike back finally had targets they could reach, and their vengeance was absolute and merciless. Turkish horse archers, deadly at range but helpless in close combat, died by the hundreds as they tried desperately to reach the safety of the hills. Taqi ad-Din's wing, already shattered by the Hospitallers' unauthorized charge, disintegrated completely when struck by fresh Crusader reserves that had been held back. 7,000 Kurdish cavalry, the pride of Saladin's right wing and veterans of countless victories, ceased to exist as an organized fighting force within minutes. Their commander himself barely escaped with his life, abandoning his war banner and personal equipment in his desperate flight toward Damascus. The most shocking moment came when Richard, blood streaming from a dozen minor wounds that covered his armor, caught sight of Saladin's personal standard less than 200 yards away through the chaos. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, the fate of the Third Crusade hung in the balance as the English king spurred his exhausted warhorse toward the Sultan of Egypt and Syria for single combat. Muslim bodyguards threw themselves between their lord and the charging Christian king. Richard's lance found its mark, twice punching through armor before superior numbers forced him to wheel away or be dragged down, but the psychological impact was devastating beyond measure. Saladin had been moments from capture or death at the hands of his greatest enemy. By noon, when the sun reached its peak, 35,000 Muslim warriors had been reduced to fewer than 8,000 effective fighters capable of holding a weapon. 7,000 enemy dead carpeted the coastal plain in layers, their blood turning the sand, dark beneath the blazing Palestinian sun that beat down on the carnage. Saladin's baggage train, worth a fortune in gold and supplies that represented months of preparation, fell intact to the Crusaders, who could barely believe their luck. Most crushing of all, for Muslim morale, 32 Muslim commanders lay among the dead, their expertise and experience, built over decades, irreplaceable. Yet in the moment of absolute triumph, when total victory was within grasp, Richard made the decision that would haunt the Third Crusade forever and change the course of history in ways no one could predict. As his knights prepared to pursue the broken enemy army and finish Saladin once and for all, by hunting him down, the Lionheart raised his royal banner high and signaled halt with 3 sharp horn blasts. The greatest tactical victory in Crusader history was about to become the greatest strategic mistake. The silence that descended over the battlefield was more terrifying than the screams of battle and dying men had been. Richard's horn signal echoed across the coastal plain, calling his knights back from pursuit, just as Saladin's broken army streamed toward the hills in complete disorder. The greatest tactical victory in Crusader history had lasted exactly 17 minutes, from first charge to final horn blast, but the decision to end it would echo through centuries of warfare. As dust settled over 7,000 Muslim corpses scattered across 2 miles of sand, the true cost of perfect warfare began to reveal itself. The immediate aftermath defied comprehension for anyone who understood medieval combat. Crusader casualties numbered fewer than 700 dead and wounded combined, a loss rate so minimal it seemed divinely ordained by God himself as proof of righteous cause. Yet scattered across 2 miles of blood-soaked sand lay the remnants of Saladin's invincible army that had conquered everything in its path. Muslim chroniclers would later claim the Sultan lost only 3,000 men in their attempts to minimize the disaster, but Christian sources counted bodies methodically. 7,000 warriors who had awakened that morning, expecting easy victory over exhausted crusaders, now fed the vultures circling overhead in lazy spirals. What shocked even veteran knights who had fought in dozens of battles was the completeness of the psychological collapse they had witnessed. These were not the broken remnants of some feudal levy of peasants, but professional soldiers who had conquered Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo. Mamluks who had never retreated in their entire lives, abandoned equipment worth fortunes in their panic. Turkish horse archers, masters of mounted warfare, who had terrorized enemies for generations, threw down their composite bows and fled on foot. Most telling of all, 32 Muslim commanders lay among the dead, their leadership and experience irreplaceable. Brother Garnier de Nablus, whose unauthorized charge had triggered the avalanche that destroyed Saladin's army, surveyed the wreckage with grim satisfaction despite his wounds. His hospitallers had suffered 40% casualties during the morning bombardment, but their sacrifice had purchased something beyond price. Proof that Saladin could be beaten in open battle, that Muslim military superiority was a myth. The marshal himself bore 3 arrow wounds and a lance thrust that had punched through his mail armor and could have killed him, yet he remained in the saddle, directing the collection of wounded and the systematic stripping of enemy dead. But here is what the chronicles, written by monks, do not reveal about Richard's fateful decision to halt pursuit when victory was complete. The Lionheart had calculated that destroying Saladin's army completely would require at least 4 hours of hard riding across broken terrain that favored defenders. His knights were exhausted from the march, and the battle their horses blown from the devastating charge that had broken the enemy. More critically, pursuing a broken enemy meant abandoning the captured baggage train worth more than the annual revenue of most European kingdoms. Richard chose certain wealth over possible annihilation in a decision that made tactical sense but strategic disaster. The strategic implications became clear within hours, as scouts reported Saladin's movement. Saladin's escape, with 8,000 survivors, meant the Third Crusade's primary objective remained unfulfilled despite the victory. Jerusalem still lay 40 miles inland, its walls intact, and its garrison reinforced by the Sultan's retreating forces who would recover. The victory at Arsuf had eliminated one Muslim army, but Saladin commanded others scattered across his empire. Egypt remained unconquered, Damascus unthreatened by Christian forces. Most crucially, the Sultan himself lived to fight another day and learn from his mistake. The psychological impact proved even more significant than the tactical result in the long term. For 4 years, Christian Europe had watched helplessly as Saladin rolled up Crusader territories like parchment, seemingly invincible. Hatton had established Muslim military superiority as an article of faith that could not be questioned. Arsuf shattered that perception completely in 17 minutes. Word of Richard's victory would reach London, Paris, and Rome within months, revitalizing support for the Crusade and inspiring fresh recruitment drives across the continent. Yet among the Crusader leadership, surveying the battlefield, doubt crept in like poison. Raymond of Tripoli, surveying the battlefield carnage with experienced eyes, posed the question that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. If we can slaughter them so completely in open battle, why do we not march directly to Jerusalem while they still reel from this defeat? The king's response revealed the strategic paralysis that would define the remainder of the Third Crusade. We are too few to besiege the Holy City, while Saladin's field army remains intact. The cruel mathematics were inescapable, no matter how brilliant the tactics. Richard could win every battle through superior tactics, but he could not win the war without the resources to follow through. Saladin would learn from Arsuf, avoiding pitched battles while bleeding the Crusaders through attrition and harassment. The Sultan had lost an army, but preserved his kingdom and his life. The Lionheart had achieved the impossible, but gained nothing beyond a single day's glory that would fade. As evening fell over the coastal plain, smoke from burning enemy equipment filled the air with the acrid smell of victory turned pyrrhic. The king, who had crushed 30,000 warriors in 17 minutes, discovered that some triumphs contain the seeds of ultimate defeat. The ripple effects of those 17 minutes would determine the fate of Christianity in the East for the next 7 centuries. Within days of the victory, Richard's army captured Jaffa without resistance, as planned, establishing the crucial supply base he had risked everything to obtain. But Saladin, bloodied and humiliated by defeat, had learned the lesson that would ultimately save his empire. Never again would he offer pitched battle to concentrated Crusader forces. The Sultan, who had built his reputation on military audacity, transformed overnight into a master of defensive warfare and strategic patience. The tactical revolution unleashed at Arsuf spread across medieval Europe like wildfire through manuscript. Richard's coordinated wedge formations, combining disciplined infantry with precisely timed cavalry charges, became the template for every major military power. The Swiss pike squares that would dominate European battlefields for the next 3 centuries trace their lineage directly to the formations that shattered Saladin's army that day. Military academies, from Paris to Vienna, still study the Lionheart's perfect timing. Centuries later, the way he transformed a desperate defensive action into crushing offensive victory through sheer force of will and tactical genius. Yet the strategic consequences proved devastating for Christian ambitions in the Holy Land. Saladin's survival at Arsuf allowed him to implement the scorched earth campaign that would strangle the Third Crusade. Instead of seeking decisive battles, he knew he would lose the Sultan, led the Crusaders through constant harassment, supply, interdiction, and psychological warfare. Richard's perfect tactical weapon proved useless against an enemy who refused to fight on his terms. The king, who could destroy 30,000 warriors in minutes, found himself helpless against thousands of individual raiders who struck at dawn and vanished into the desert. The psychological impact cut both ways like a sword with two edges. Arsuf entered Christian mythology as proof that faith and discipline could overcome impossible odds, inspiring recruitment drives that drew tens of thousands of volunteers to subsequent crusades. Yet it also taught Muslim commanders that Western heavy cavalry properly deployed was nearly unstoppable in open battle. This lesson shaped Islamic military doctrine for generations, emphasizing mobility, defensive positions, and avoiding the kind of concentrated assault that had proved so catastrophic. Here is the cruel irony that haunts military historians studying this campaign. Richard's mercy at Arsuf, his decision to preserve his army, rather than pursue total victory, made strategic sense, but guaranteed ultimate failure. The king, who understood battlefield tactics with scientific precision, proved incapable of strategic thinking beyond the immediate engagement. By saving Saladin's life, he condemned Jerusalem to remain in Muslim hands for another 700 years. When the Ottomans finally fell, in 1917, British officers entering the Holy City carried maps drawn from Richard's reconnaissance report. The human cost became clear only in retrospect when historians tallied the losses. Those 700 Crusader casualties represented irreplaceable military expertise that could never be rebuilt. Each fallen knight had required years of training and equipment worth more than most villages. The 17-minute victory consumed resources that the Crusader states could not afford, no matter how spectacular the exchange rate. Saladin's 7,000 dead, by contrast, could be replaced within months from the vast recruiting grounds of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Modern warfare bears the invisible imprint of Arsuf in ways most generals never recognize when they study tactics. The principle that discipline and timing can overcome numerical superiority echoes through every military academy from West Point to Sandhurst. Richard's coordinated, combined arms tactics, integrating infantry squares with cavalry charges, established patterns that would dominate European warfare until the invention of gunpowder changed everything. The psychological lesson proved equally enduring across centuries. Impossible odds mean nothing if you can force the enemy to fight on your terms at the moment of your choosing. September 7th, 1191. The pre-dawn darkness that had hidden 20,000 desperate crusaders gave way to blazing noon that revealed 7,000 Muslim dead scattered across the sand like broken dolls. Yet the king who achieved the impossible, who crushed Saladin's finest warriors in 17 minutes of perfect warfare, discovered that some victories are too complete to be strategic. In proving that discipline could triumph over desperation, Richard the Lionheart wrote the greatest tactical masterpiece in Crusader history and ensured that Jerusalem would never be his. The legacy of those 17 minutes extends far beyond medieval warfare into the modern age. Every coordinated military operation, every combined arms assault, every calculated gamble on perfect timing traces its DNA back to what Richard accomplished on the coastal plains of Arsuf. Military historians still debate whether his decision to halt pursuit was wisdom or cowardice, but the mathematics are clear. 7,000 enemies dead for 700 allies lost represents the most lopsided victory in medieval history. The Battle of Arsus stands as the perfect example of how tactical brilliance cannot overcome strategic limitation. Richard proved that courage and discipline and perfect timing could overcome any numerical disadvantage when circumstances aligned. But he also proved that winning every battle means nothing if you lack the resources to win the war. Saladin learned this lesson and used it to preserve his empire, while Richard died 7 years later besieging a minor castle in France over a dispute about buried treasure. His greatest victory turned to ashes. Think about what this means for understanding military history and human achievement. The most perfect military victory in Crusader history became the monument to everything the Third Crusade could not accomplish. Despite fighting with legendary skill and impossible courage, individual brilliance had met systemic limitations and discovered that some problems cannot be solved by better tactics or greater heroism. The 17 minutes that broke Saladin's army also broke any chance of reclaiming Jerusalem, creating a paradox that still fascinates historians. If you want to discover more impossible victories that changed history, more battles where the mathematics said defeat was certain, but courage said otherwise, check out our playlist on medieval warfare. We have analyzed dozens of battles where outnumbered forces achieved the impossible through tactics that still influence modern combat. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we are covering the Battle of Montgizard, where 500 knights crushed 26,000 warriors in an even more impossible victory. And if you think 17 minutes of perfect warfare was impressive, wait until you see what a dying teenage leper king accomplished against an army 52 times his size. Drop a comment below telling us which impossible battle you want us to analyze next. The algorithm loves engagement, and your comments help us reach more history enthusiasts who appreciate military genius. Share this video with anyone who thinks modern tactics invented combined arms warfare, because Richard the Lionheart was coordinating infantry and cavalry assaults 700 years before tanks and artillery made it standard doctrine. Hit that like button if this story of tactical perfection and strategic failure taught you something new about the relationship between winning battles and winning wars, and remember that sometimes the greatest victories contain the seeds of ultimate defeat.